At the Mother's Day lunch, my daughter said, "This freeloader only comes for the food." Everyone laughed at me and I left without eating. The next day she received a letter. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I should have known better than to expect anything different. At 67 years old, you'd think I would have learned by now that hope is a dangerous thing when it comes to my daughter Hazel. But there I was, standing on her doorstep on Mother's Day morning, holding a store-bought pie because my arthritis makes baking from scratch nearly impossible these days, foolishly believing that maybe this year would be different. The house looked perfect as always. Hazel had inherited her father's eye for presentation. The front lawn was manicured to magazine standards, the flower beds bursting with seasonal blooms that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I rang the doorbell and waited, smoothing down my best dress, the navy blue one I'd worn to church for the past 3 years. When Hazel opened the door, her smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. It never did anymore. "Oh, Mom, you made it," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The way she said it made it sound like my arrival was uncertain, even though I'd confirmed twice over the phone that I'd be there at noon sharp. The living room was filled with people I barely knew. Hazel's in-laws dominated the space, her mother-in-law Patricia sitting in the center of the sofa like a queen holding court, surrounded by various relatives I'd met maybe twice in the 8 years since Hazel married Derek. My daughter had always been drawn to Derek's family. They had money, status, the kind of connections that open doors. Everything my late husband Robert and I had never been able to provide. "Everyone, my mother is here," Hazel announced, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. Patricia gave me one of those polite smiles that wealthy women perfect, warm on the surface, cold underneath. "Judith, how lovely," Patricia said, though she didn't get up to greet me. "We were just discussing the charity auction next month. Such important work we do for the community." I nodded and smiled, clutching my pie tighter. I'd learned long ago that conversations about charity auctions and country club events weren't meant to include me. I was background noise in my own daughter's life. Derek appeared from the kitchen, beer in hand, and gave me a brief nod. "Hey Judith, how's the apartment treating you?" He always asked about my small one-bedroom apartment like it was some kind of novelty, this concept of living modestly. I'd moved there 5 years ago after selling the house where I'd raised Hazel, needing something smaller and more manageable on my fixed income. "It's fine, thank you," I replied, though fine was generous. The neighbors were loud, the plumbing temperamental, and the stairs were becoming harder to navigate with each passing month. But it was what I could afford. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, and I found myself seated at the far end of the table, between Derek's teenage nephew who spent the entire meal texting and Patricia's sister, who seemed more interested in discussing her recent cruise than acknowledging my presence. Hazel flitted around like the perfect hostess, making sure everyone's wine glass stayed full, laughing at the right moments, playing her role flawlessly. I picked at my food, a beautiful spread that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The conversation flowed around me like I was invisible. Talk of vacation homes and private schools and business ventures I couldn't begin to understand. Every so often, I'd try to contribute something, a small comment or question, but it would fall flat or be quickly overshadowed by someone else's more interesting observation. Then came the moment that changed everything. Patricia was telling a story about her housekeeper's daughter graduating from college, how proud the woman was, when she turned to me with that practiced smile. "Judith, you must be so proud of Hazel. Such an accomplished daughter, such a beautiful home. You're so lucky to have her take care of you." Take care of me. The words stung because they weren't true. Hazel didn't take care of me. I took care of myself, had been taking care of myself since Robert died 6 years ago. But I smiled and nodded because that's what you do. "Actually," Hazel said, her voice carrying that tone I'd learned to dread, "Mom doesn't really need much taking care of. She's pretty independent." She paused, and I saw something shift in her expression. "Though she does love coming over for meals. Don't you, Mom?" There was something in the way she said it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The table had gone quiet, waiting. "This esfomeda only comes for the food anyway." The Portuguese word hit me like a slap. Esfomeda. Starving woman. Beggar. I taught Hazel that word years ago when we'd visited Brazil, back when she was 12 and actually enjoyed spending time with me. Now she was using it as a weapon. The table erupted in laughter. Not uncomfortable chuckles but genuine amusement. Patricia covered her mouth with her napkin, her shoulders shaking. Derek nearly choked on his wine. Even the teenager looked up from his phone to smirk. I sat there, my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling the heat rush to my cheeks. 67 years old, and I was being mocked like a child at the lunch table. By my own daughter. On Mother's Day. Hazel, Derek said through his laughter. You're terrible. What? It's true, she shrugged, grinning at her audience. She shows up here every week with some excuse to stay for dinner. I swear she times it perfectly. My chest felt tight. I set down my fork and reached for my water glass, but my hands were shaking so badly I was afraid I'd spill it. The laughter continued around me, and I realized that this wasn't a spontaneous moment of cruelty. This was entertainment. I was the entertainment. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor loud enough to cut through the laughter. Excuse me, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Oh, Mom, don't be dramatic, Hazel called after me as I walked toward the front door. We're just having fun. Fun. That's what my humiliation was to them. Fun. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't thank anyone for the meal I'd barely touched. I just walked out of that house and didn't look back, even when I heard Derek say, "Should someone go after her?" And Hazel's response, "She'll be fine. She always is." As I drove home in my 12-year-old Honda, my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall until I was safely inside my small apartment. Only then did I allow myself to cry, not just for what had happened that day, but for all the years I'd spent making excuses for my daughter's coldness, telling myself that she was just busy, just stressed, just different from me. I sat in my tiny living room that night, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting for Hazel to call and apologize, to say she hadn't meant it, that she'd been showing off for her in-laws and it had gotten out of hand. The phone never rang. But the next morning, something else arrived that would change everything. Something that would show my daughter exactly who she was dealing with, and what she stood to lose. I woke up Monday morning with that hollow feeling still sitting in my chest like a stone. The kind of emptiness that comes after you've cried yourself out, and there's nothing left but the raw truth of your situation. I made my coffee in the small kitchen of my apartment, the same routine I'd followed for 5 years now, but everything felt different somehow. Heavier. The humiliation from yesterday kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. The laughter. The way Hazel had looked at me like I was some kind of pathetic creature. The word esfumata echoing in my ears. I'd barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed about that dining room table, all those faces looking at me with amusement. I was still in my robe when my phone rang at 8:30. The caller ID showed Hazel's number, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe she'd realized how cruel she'd been. Mom. Her voice was different. Tight. Strained. Yes, sweetheart. I tried to keep the hope out of my voice. Did you send something to my house? Some kind of legal document? I frowned, setting down my coffee cup. What are you talking about? A letter came this morning. From a law firm. It says I have 3 days to vacate the property. Her voice was rising, panic creeping in. 3 days, Mom. They're saying I don't have legal right to be here. My heart started pounding, but not from worry. From something else entirely. Something I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. What law firm? Morrison, Blake and Associates. Mom, what is this? Is this some kind of mistake? Did you accidentally give someone our address for something? Morrison, Blake and Associates. I knew that name. I'd used them 15 years ago when I'd made the most difficult financial decision of my life. When I'd taken out a second mortgage on the house Robert and I had spent 30 years paying off, just to help my daughter when her world was falling apart. Mom? Are you there? I'm here. My voice sounded strange even to me. Calm. Too calm. Well, what should I do? Derek's freaking out. We can't just pack up and leave in 3 days. This is our home. We've lived here for 8 years. Our home. That's what she called it. What she'd always called it. Hazel, I said slowly. What's the address on that letter? She rattled off the numbers and street name. The same address where I'd spent yesterday being humiliated. The same address where my daughter had called me a beggar in front of her in-laws. Mom, you're scaring me. Do you know something about this? I walked to my bedroom, to the small filing cabinet I kept in the closet. My hands moved automatically to the folder labeled Property Documents. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years, papers that detailed a transaction I'd hoped never to think about again. The deed was right there, my name printed in black and white. Judith Eleanor Hartwell, sole owner of the property at the address Hazel had just given me. "Mom, I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before she could respond. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the document in my shaking hands. 15 years ago, when Hazel's first marriage had imploded spectacularly, when her ex-husband had left her with nothing but debt and a toddler to raise, I'd done what any mother would do. I'd saved her. She'd been living in a tiny apartment then, barely making ends meet as a single mother. She cried to me about how unfair it was, how she deserved better, how she wanted stability for little Madison. So I'd made the choice. I'd leveraged everything Robert and I had built together to buy her a house. A beautiful house in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. But I'd made one crucial mistake. I'd put the deed in my name temporarily, telling myself I'd transfer it to her once everything was settled, once she was back on her feet. Then Robert had his first heart attack, and I'd gotten distracted by medical bills and caretaking. Then Madison had started having problems at school, and Hazel had needed emotional support more than paperwork. Then Derek had come along, and suddenly there were wedding plans and new dynamics, and somehow the conversation about the deed had never happened. Years passed. Hazel redecorated, renovated, treated the house like it was hers. Because in every way that mattered it was. I'd bought it for her. I'd intended it to be hers. The fact that my name was still on the papers had become irrelevant. Except now it wasn't. My phone rang again. "Hazel. Mom, I need you to come over here right now. Derek's called his father, and he says this looks legitimate. We need to figure out what's going on. I'll be there in an hour." "An hour? Mom, this is an emergency. I need to get dressed first." This time I hung up on her. I took my time getting ready. I chose my clothes carefully. Not the old navy dress from yesterday, but the charcoal gray suit I'd worn to Robert's funeral. It still fit, though it hung a little looser than it had 6 years ago. I did my hair, put on lipstick, even dug out the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the pathetic woman who'd been mocked at yesterday's lunch table. I saw someone else entirely, someone I'd forgotten I could be. The drive to Hazel's house felt different this time. Yesterday I'd driven there with hope and a store-bought pie. Today I drove there with purpose and a folder full of legal documents. Derek answered the door, his face flushed with stress. "Judith, thank God. Hazel's been pacing around here like a caged animal. Do you know anything about this letter?" "Where is she?" "In the kitchen on the phone with some lawyer friend of ours." I walked through the house I'd bought but had never been allowed to claim. Past the living room where I'd been ignored. Past the dining room where I'd been humiliated. Into the kitchen where my daughter stood with her back to me, gesticulating wildly as she spoke into her phone. "No, you don't understand," she was saying. "This is my house. I've been living here for 8 years. My name is on the utilities, the insurance, everything." She turned when she heard my footsteps, and I saw real fear in her eyes for the first time in years. "Mom, please tell me you know how to fix this." I set my purse down on the granite countertop, the same countertop I'd paid to have installed during the renovation 3 years ago. The one Hazel had picked out without consulting me, naturally. "Hazel," I said, my voice steady and clear, "we need to talk." Something in my tone made her end her phone call immediately. Derek appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sudden silence. "The letter isn't a mistake," I continued. "Morrison, Blake and Associates are my lawyers. Have been for 15 years. Hazel's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I opened my purse and pulled out the folder. "This house belongs to me, Hazel. It always has." The silence that followed was different from yesterday's silence. Yesterday's had been filled with cruel amusement. This one was filled with shock, confusion, and the slow dawning of terrible understanding. "That's impossible," Derek said. "We've been paying the mortgage for 8 years. "No," I said quietly. "You've been paying me rent. Though we never called it that." Hazel's legs seemed to give out. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, staring at me like I just told her the world was flat. But this is my house. My home. Is it? I asked. Because yesterday you made it very clear that I was just a guest here. An unwelcome one. And for the first time in years, I had my daughter's complete, undivided attention. The kitchen fell so quiet I could hear the expensive clock on the wall ticking. Hazel stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language, her mouth slightly open, her face drained of color. Derek stood frozen in the doorway, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. What do you mean this is your house? Hazel's voice came out as barely a whisper. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly, placing the folder of documents on the table between us. My hands were surprisingly steady. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of a situation involving my daughter. I mean exactly what I said. I own this house. I bought it in 2009 when your first marriage fell apart, and you needed somewhere to live with Madison. But Hazel shook her head, confusion written all over her face. But we pay the mortgage. We've been paying it for 8 years. You've been paying me, I corrected gently, $750 a month, which you always said was your contribution to household expenses when we discussed it. I never corrected that assumption. Derek finally found his voice. This is insane. You're telling me my wife has been living in her mother's house this whole time and didn't know it? I turned to look at him, this man who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 8 years, who'd watched his family mock me yesterday without saying a word. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Why? Hazel's voice cracked. Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you tell me? The question hung in the air, and suddenly I was transported back 15 years, to one of the darkest periods of both our lives. Hazel had been 27 then, divorced from her first husband who'd left her with nothing but debt and a 3-year-old daughter. She'd been living in a cramped apartment, working 2 part-time jobs, barely keeping her head above water. Do you remember what you said to me when I first offered to help you buy a house? I asked. Hazel frowned, clearly struggling to recall. No, that was a long time ago. You said you'd rather die than be a charity case. You said you'd figure it out on your own, that you didn't need anyone's pity. I opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. You wrote me a letter. I kept it. I unfolded the letter, my daughter's angry handwriting still clear after all these years. Mom, I appreciate that you want to help, but I won't be another burden on you and Dad. I won't be the daughter who couldn't make it on her own. I'll find a way. Hazel's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. I remember writing that. You were so proud, so determined to prove you could handle everything yourself. But I watched you for months getting thinner, more exhausted. Madison was acting out at daycare because of all the instability. You were drowning, sweetheart, but you were too stubborn to ask for help. So you bought me a house without telling me? Derek's voice was sharp, accusatory. I turned to him again, feeling that familiar flare of irritation I'd learned to suppress over the years. I didn't buy her a house without telling her. I bought a house and let her believe she was contributing to buying it herself. That's the same thing, he snapped. No, it's not. My voice was firm now, the voice I'd used when Hazel was a teenager testing boundaries. If I'd given her the house, she would have refused it. Her pride wouldn't have allowed it. So I found another way. I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the kitchen table like I was laying out evidence. Bank statements showing the down payment I'd made using the equity from Roberts and my home. Mortgage documents with my name as the sole borrower. Insurance papers listing me as the owner. I took out a second mortgage on our house, I continued, looking directly at Hazel. Your father and I had finally paid it off after 30 years, and I leveraged it to buy this place. The monthly payments you've been making don't even cover half of what I've been paying to the bank all these years. Hazel's face had gone from pale to gray. Dad knew about this? Of course he knew. He wasn't happy about it at first. He said we were enabling you, that you needed to learn to stand on your own feet. But when he saw how much happier Madison was after you moved in here, how much more stable your life became, he agreed it was the right thing to do. So you've been, what? Subsidizing our life for 15 years. Derek's tone was incredulous. I've been helping my daughter and granddaughter have the stability they deserved, I said sharply. Something you benefited from when you married into this family and moved into a house you thought your wife owned. The silence stretched between us again. I watched Hazel process everything, saw the moment when the full implications hit her. Her comfortable life, her status among Derek's family, her sense of security. All of it had been built on a foundation I'd provided without her knowledge. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally, her voice small. "I thought about yesterday's lunch table. About the laughter. About the word esfumata and the way she'd looked at me like I was something distasteful she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Because yesterday you made it clear that I'm not welcome in this house. You called me a beggar in front of your in-laws, laughed at me like I was some pathetic old woman who shows up for free meals." I kept my voice level, but I could feel the hurt underneath it, sharp as broken glass. It occurred to me that maybe it's time you knew exactly who's been begging whom all these years. Hazel's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I didn't mean." "Yes, you did." I cut her off. "You meant every word." And that's when I realized that all these years of protecting your pride, of letting you believe you were independent and self-sufficient, I'd been doing you a disservice. I'd been enabling you to treat me badly because you thought you didn't need me. Derek ran his hands through his hair, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "So what happens now? Are you seriously going to kick us out over one bad lunch?" I looked around the kitchen at the granite countertops I'd paid for, the stainless steel appliances I'd chosen when Hazel decided the old ones weren't good enough for entertaining Derek's family. Every upgrade, every improvement over the years had come out of my pocket, while Hazel took credit for creating a beautiful home. "The letter gives you 3 days to vacate," I said calmly. "That wasn't my decision. That was my lawyer's recommendation when I told him I wanted to discuss the living arrangements with you." "Discuss?" Hazel wiped her eyes, hope creeping into her voice. "So we can work something out?" I stood up, gathering my documents back into the folder. For 15 years, I'd been the invisible support system holding up their lives. For 8 years I'd watched Derek's family treat me like an outsider, while they enjoyed the fruits of my sacrifice. Yesterday, I'd been humiliated in the house I owned by the daughter I'd given everything to protect. "We'll see," I said, walking toward the door. "You have 3 days to think about what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. What kind of daughter you want to be. Because the one who showed up yesterday, she's not someone I recognize anymore." I paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at them both sitting there in stunned silence. "And Hazel? The next time you want to call someone esfumata, you might want to make sure they're not the one keeping a roof over your head." I walked out of the house I owned, leaving my daughter to contemplate the true cost of cruelty. I didn't go straight home after leaving Hazel's house. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly through the neighborhood where I'd lived for 37 years before moving to my small apartment. These tree-lined streets held so many memories. Walking Hazel to school, teaching her to ride her bike, hosting birthday parties in our backyard. Back when she actually wanted to spend time with me. I pulled into the parking lot of the small coffee shop on Maple Street, the one where I used to meet my friend Eleanor every Tuesday before she moved to Florida 3 years ago. I needed time to think, to process what had just happened, and somehow being surrounded by the familiar bustle of other people felt comforting. As I waited in line for my coffee, I heard a voice behind me. "Judith? Judith Hartwell." I turned to see Margaret Chen, who had lived 2 houses down from me for over 20 years. Her face lit up with genuine warmth, something I'd almost forgotten existed after yesterday's humiliation. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day. How are you settling into your new place?" We found a small table by the window, and for the first time in months, I found myself in a conversation where someone actually seemed interested in my answers. Margaret asked about my apartment, my health, whether I was enjoying retirement. Normal, caring questions that made me remember what it felt like to be treated like a person instead of an inconvenience. "And how's Hazel doing?" Margaret asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. "That beautiful house of hers must keep her busy." Something in her tone made me look up sharply. There was an odd quality to the way she'd said it, like she was testing the waters for something. She's doing well," I said carefully. Margaret nodded slowly, then seemed to hesitate. "Judith, can I ask you something? And please don't take this the wrong way." My heart started beating faster. "Of course." Well, it's just that. Last month at the grocery store I ran into Hazel and that husband of hers. Derek, right? And we got to talking about the neighborhood, you know how it is. I mentioned how much I missed having you around and… She paused, looking uncomfortable. What did she say, Margaret? She said you'd had to downsize because you were struggling financially, that you'd made some poor decisions with your retirement funds and couldn't afford to keep your house anymore. Margaret's voice was gentle but concerned. She said she and Derek had been trying to help you out, but that you were too proud to accept much assistance. The coffee cup felt heavy in my hands. She said that. And then Derek jumped in and said something about how hard it is when elderly parents don't make good financial choices. Margaret's cheeks flushed. I'm sorry, Judith. I probably shouldn't have brought this up, but it just didn't sound like the woman I'd known for 20 years. You were always so sensible with money. I stared out the window, watching cars drive past on the street where I'd once belonged, where people had once known the real me, not the version Hazel had apparently been sharing. Margaret, can I ask you something? Has Hazel ever mentioned, well, anything else about our relationship? Margaret's expression grew more uncomfortable. Oh, honey, I really shouldn't repeat gossip. Please. I need to know. She sighed, then leaned forward slightly. Well, there was that incident at the church bake sale last year. Patricia Morrison, you know, Derek's mother, was there with Hazel. They were talking to a group of women about elder care, and Patricia was going on about how challenging it can be when aging parents become too dependent. My stomach clenched. And Hazel agreed with her. Said something about how some older people lose their sense of boundaries, show up unannounced expecting to be fed and entertained. She laughed and said she'd learned to time her grocery shopping, so she wouldn't be home when… Margaret trailed off, looking stricken. When I might drop by, I finished for her. Judith, I'm sure she didn't mean it the way it sounded, but I knew she had meant it exactly the way it sounded, just like she'd meant every word of yesterday's humiliation. Is there anything else? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Margaret hesitated again. There was something Derek said at the hardware store a few months ago. My husband Bill was there picking up some paint, and Derek was complaining about having to drive you to doctor's appointments. He said something about how you could afford to take a taxi but preferred to guilt family members into chauffeur service. Each revelation felt like a small knife wound. I thought about all the times I'd asked Derek for rides, always apologetically, always offering to pay for gas. I'd stopped driving at night after a small fender bender last year, and some of my specialists were across town in areas where parking was difficult for someone my age. But Judith, Margaret continued. Bill said Derek seemed almost proud of it, like he was showing off how generous he was being with his difficult mother-in-law. Difficult mother-in-law. Is that what I'd become to them? A burden they tolerated and complained about behind my back? I finished my coffee in silence while Margaret tried to change the subject to lighter topics, but my mind was spinning. How many people in this community had heard similar stories? How many times had my daughter painted me as a pathetic, needy old woman who couldn't take care of herself? After Margaret and I parted ways, I drove to the grocery store where I'd shopped for decades. As I pushed my cart through the familiar aisles, I found myself wondering what the cashiers thought of me, what stories they'd heard. Did they see me as the independent woman I'd always tried to be, or as the burden Hazel apparently described to anyone who would listen? At the checkout, young Sandra, who'd been working there for at least 5 years, gave me her usual friendly smile. How are you doing today, Mrs. Hartwell? I'm fine, Sandra. How's your little boy? Growing like a weed. 2nd grade now. She paused while scanning my items. Oh, I saw your daughter here last week. She mentioned you've been having some health issues. My hand stilled on my purse. Health issues? Yeah, she seemed really concerned. Said you've been having some memory problems, getting confused about things. Sandra's voice was full of sympathy. It's so hard when our parents start having those kinds of struggles. Memory problems. Getting confused about things. I stared at Sandra, this sweet girl who'd known me for years, who'd never seen me be anything but sharp and capable. But now she was looking at me with pity, like I was some addled old woman who couldn't be trusted to remember my own name. Did she say anything else? I managed to ask. Sandra looked uncomfortable, like she'd said too much already. Just that the family was keeping a close eye on you, making sure you were eating properly and taking your medications. She bought a lot of easy-to-prepare meals, said she was stocking your freezer. I paid for my groceries in a daze and walked to my car on unsteady legs. Once I was safely inside, I gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what I'd learned. Hazel hadn't just been dismissive of me yesterday. She'd been systematically destroying my reputation in the community for months, maybe years, painting me as financially irresponsible, mentally declining, overly dependent, and generally burdensome. Every person who'd shown me sympathy lately, every gentle inquiry about my well-being, had been based on lies my own daughter had told about me. The woman who lived in my house, who'd benefited from my financial support for 15 years, who'd let me believe we had a loving relationship despite her coldness, had been stabbing me in the back with every casual conversation. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, letting the full scope of Hazel's betrayal sink in. It wasn't just about yesterday's cruelty. It was about years of deliberate character assassination, years of making sure that if anyone heard both sides of our story, they'd automatically assume I was the problem. My phone buzzed with a text message. Hazel. Mom, we need to talk. Can you come back? Derek thinks we can work something out. I stared at the message for a long time. Derek thinks we can work something out. Not Hazel was sorry. Not that she wanted to apologize. Just that Derek, who discovered his comfortable life was built on my generosity, thought we could negotiate. I typed back a single word. Tomorrow. Then I drove home to my small apartment to think about what kind of daughter spreads lies about her mother's mental health, and what kind of mother finally stops enabling that behavior. The 3-day deadline suddenly felt like the most generous gift I could give them. I spent that night sitting in my small living room, surrounded by photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of Hazel as a baby, as a toddler taking her first steps, as a little girl blowing out birthday candles. In every photo she was smiling, and in most of them so was I. When had we stopped smiling at each other? I found the album from her high school graduation, the one where she'd hugged me so tightly after the ceremony and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I couldn't have done this without you." The girl in that photo bore no resemblance to the woman who'd called me esfumada in front of her in-laws. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams that felt more like memories. Robert holding my hand as we watched Hazel walk down the aisle at her first wedding. The day Madison was born and Hazel had cried as she placed my first grandchild in my arms. "I want to be the kind of mother you were to me," she'd said then. I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Some decisions, I realized, make themselves if you're brave enough to listen. By 8 o'clock I was dressed and ready. Not in the navy dress I'd worn to that disastrous Mother's Day lunch, and not in the formal suit from yesterday's confrontation. Today I chose a simple blue blouse and slacks, the kind of outfit I'd worn to countless school plays and soccer games when Hazel was young, when she still wanted me there. The drive to her house felt different this time. Not charged with anger like yesterday, not heavy with hope like Sunday, just quiet, purposeful. Derek answered the door, and I could see immediately that he hadn't slept well either. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Judith, thank God. Hazel's been up all night. She's pretty upset." I followed him through the house, noting details I'd never paid attention to before. The hardwood floors I'd helped pay to refinish. The crown molding that had been added during the renovation 3 years ago. The chandelier in the foyer that Hazel had insisted was necessary for entertaining. Hazel was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger somehow, more like the daughter I remembered. But when she looked up at me, her eyes were red from crying. "Mom!" Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry about what I said on Sunday. I was showing off for Derek's family, and I said something horrible. But you can't really kick us out of our home over one stupid comment. Our home." Even now, even knowing the truth, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge whose house this really was. I pulled out the chair across from her, the same one I'd sat in yesterday when I'd revealed the truth about the property. "Hazel, this isn't about one comment." "Then what?" Derek jumped in before she could respond. "Look, I get it. You're hurt. But we can work this out like adults. We'll pay you market rate rent. We'll sign a lease. Whatever you want." I looked at him steadily. What I want is for you to tell me why you thought it was appropriate to discuss my supposed mental decline with strangers at the hardware store. The color drained from his face. What? Or why you felt the need to complain about driving me to doctor's appointments, when I always offered to pay for gas and only asked when I absolutely had to. Hazel's eyes widened. Mom, how did you? Yesterday after I left here, I ran into Margaretchen at the coffee shop. And Sandra at the grocery store. It seems you've both been very busy sharing stories about what a burden I am. I kept my voice calm, but inside I felt that familiar ache of betrayal. Memory problems, Hazel? Really? She had the grace to look ashamed. I never said you had memory problems. You told Sandra I was getting confused about things, that the family was keeping a close eye on me. I leaned forward slightly. What exactly was I confused about? The fact that I've been paying your mortgage for 15 years? The fact that I own this house? Because those seemed to be the only things I was confused about, and it turns out I was right about both. The silence stretched between us. Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that his wife's casual character assassination was about to cost them more than just their pride. I also heard about the church bake sale, I continued, where you agreed with Patricia about how challenging it is when aging parents lose their sense of boundaries. About how some older people show up expecting to be fed and entertained. Hazel's face crumpled. Mom, I was just trying to fit in with Derek's family. They have opinions about everything, and sometimes I say things to avoid conflict. So you chose to create conflict with me instead. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. You chose to make me the problem so you could have peace with people who treat you like you're lucky to be included in their family. That's not fair, Derek protested. My family has been nothing but welcoming to Hazel. I turned to look at him, this man who'd lived in my house for 8 years without ever once asking how he could help with maintenance or improvements. Who'd watched his mother treat me like hired help and never said a word. Your family tolerates Hazel because she plays by their rules. Because she makes herself smaller to fit into their world. And apparently, making me the villain was part of that performance. Hazel started crying again. But these weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen her use to get her way over the years. These seemed genuine. I never meant for it to go this far. They have so many opinions about family dynamics, and it was easier to let them think you were the needy one than to admit that you were helping us. Because admitting I was helping you would mean admitting you weren't as independent as you pretended to be. Yes, she whispered. At least she was being honest now. After years of wondering why our relationship felt so strained, why every interaction seemed loaded with tension, I couldn't understand, I finally had my answer. I hadn't been imagining the distance. Hazel had been actively creating it, casting me as the dependent mother so she could play the role of the successful daughter. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady. You have until Friday to make arrangements to move out. Mom, no. Hazel reached across the table, but I pulled my hands back. I'm selling the house. Derek shot to his feet. You can't do that. We have rights. We've been living here for 8 years. You've been living here as my guest for 8 years. Paying partial rent to cover utilities and maintenance, while I covered the actual mortgage, insurance, and property taxes. I stood up as well, surprised by how calm I felt. But guests who mock their host, who spread lies about them in the community, who treat them like an unwelcome burden. Those guests were out their welcome. Please, Hazel begged. Tell me what I can do to fix this. I'll apologize to everyone I talk to. I'll set the record straight. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd sacrificed so much for, who'd repaid that sacrifice by making me the villain in her story. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to find a way back to the relationship we'd once had. But I thought about yesterday's lunch table, about the laughter when she'd called me esfumada, about years of being treated like an obligation rather than a person. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart. Some trust once broken can't be repaired. So that's it. Derek's voice was bitter. You're going to destroy your own daughter's life over hurt feelings? I'm not destroying anything, I replied quietly. I'm simply stopping my financial support for people who clearly don't value it or me. You're both adults. You'll figure it out. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. The realtor will be here Thursday morning to take photos and measurements. I'd appreciate it if you could make sure the house is presentable. Mom, wait. Hazel called after me, her voice breaking. I love you. You have to know that. I stopped but didn't turn around. Do you? Because people who love someone don't systematically destroy their reputation. They don't mock them in public. They don't treat them like a burden while secretly depending on their generosity. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I do love you. Maybe you do, I said softly. But love without respect isn't enough anymore. I've spent too many years accepting crumbs of affection, while being treated like an inconvenience. I deserve better than that. This time when I walked out, I didn't look back. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of away from it. 6 months later, I stood on the small deck of my new cottage, watching the sun rise over Lake Minnetonka. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and I pulled my sweater closer as I sipped my coffee. Behind me, I could hear the gentle sounds of my new life awakening. The coffee maker finishing its cycle, the grandfather clock in the living room chiming 7 times, the neighbor's dog barking a friendly greeting to the day. The cottage was nothing like the grand house I'd owned in the city. It was small, cozy, with just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen barely large enough for one person. But it was mine in a way that the other house had never been. Every decision about paint colors and furniture placement was mine alone. No one else's opinions to consider. No one else's aesthetic to accommodate. The sale of Hazel's house had gone through faster than expected. The market was hot, and the property had sold within 2 weeks of listing for well above asking price. After paying off the remaining mortgage and the realtor's fees, I'd had enough left over to buy this cottage outright and still have a comfortable nest egg for the first time in 15 years. Hazel had tried calling me dozens of times in those first few weeks. I'd answered exactly once when she'd called from Madison's phone, hoping to trick me into picking up. Grandma. Madison's voice had been small, confused. Mom says you're mad at us and we have to move. My heart had broken a little at hearing my granddaughter's voice. Madison was 15 now, old enough to understand family drama but young enough to be hurt by it. I'm not mad, sweetheart, I'd told her. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about how they want to live their lives. But why can't we just say we're sorry and fix it? Out of the mouths of babes. If only it were that simple. Some things take more than just saying sorry, I'd explain gently. But this doesn't change how much I love you. I'd heard Hazel take the phone back. Mom, please. Madison doesn't understand why her grandmother suddenly doesn't want to see her anymore. I never said I didn't want to see her. I said I wouldn't continue to financially support people who treat me badly. Madison is welcome to visit me anytime she wants. How is she supposed to get here? We had to move to an apartment across town because we couldn't afford anything closer. The guilt had been immediate and sharp. But then I'd remembered the laughter at that lunch table, the lies Hazel had spread about my mental state, the years of being treated like an obligation. Some prices were too high to keep paying even for love. You'll figure it out, I'd said, echoing the words Derek had so often used when I'd asked for help with things that mattered to me. That had been 4 months ago. Since then, my phone had been blissfully quiet. I'd worried in those first weeks that I'd made a mistake, that I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, that maybe I should have found a way to work things out for Madison's sake. But then I'd remember how I'd felt sitting in that small apartment after years of being dismissed and diminished, and I'd know I'd made the right choice. The cottage had come furnished, which was perfect since I'd never accumulated much in the way of belongings during my years of prioritizing everyone else's needs over my own. But I'd slowly been adding personal touches. New curtains for the kitchen window. A small garden in the backyard where I was learning to grow tomatoes and herbs. A bird feeder that attracted cardinals and chickadees every morning. I joined the local library's book club. Something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was constantly managing Hazel's crises. I'd started taking watercolor classes at the community center. I'd even begun volunteering at the animal shelter, walking dogs and socializing cats who needed human interaction. For the first time in decades, my time was my own. My money was my own. My peace of mind was my own. The cottage next door was owned by a widow named Ruth who was exactly my age, and had a sharp wit that reminded me of my old friend Eleanor. We'd fallen into an easy routine of sharing morning coffee on weekends and taking evening walks around the lake. Yesterday, She'd invited me to join her for Thanksgiving at her son's house. He specifically asked me to bring you, she'd said with a grin. Apparently my stories about my funny neighbor have made you quite popular with the family. It had been so long since someone had wanted me around that I'd almost cried right there on her front porch. My phone buzzed as I was finishing my coffee. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Grandma, this is Madison. I got a job at the ice cream shop and saved money for the bus. Can I come visit you this weekend? I stared at the message for a long time, my heart racing. Madison had found a way. Without asking her mother for help, without making demands or expecting me to solve her transportation problem, she'd figured it out herself. I typed back. I would love that. What time does your bus arrive? Saturday at 2 p.m. Mom doesn't know I'm coming. Of course she didn't. Hazel would never approve of Madison making this effort, would probably try to stop her or use it as leverage to guilt me into reconciliation. I'll pick you up at the station. Can't wait to see you. I spent the rest of the week preparing for Madison's visit. I bought ingredients for her favorite cookies, the ones I used to make when she was little and would spend weekends at my house. I cleaned the spare bedroom and put fresh sheets on the bed. I planned activities we could do together. A visit to the local antique shops, a walk around the lake, maybe the watercolor class if she was interested. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, but I didn't care. I was early to the bus station, waiting in my car and watching for the familiar face I hadn't seen in 6 months. When Madison stepped off the bus, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd grown taller, her face more mature, less childlike. But when she spotted me through the terminal window, her face lit up with the same smile I remembered. Grandma! She ran to me and wrapped me in a hug that felt like forgiveness and love and hope all rolled into one. Oh, sweetheart. I've missed you so much. I've missed you too. Mom said you were angry at us, but I didn't understand why. She tried to explain it, but it didn't make sense. As we drove to the cottage, Madison filled me in on her life. The new school, her job at the ice cream shop, her friends, her plans for college. Normal teenage concerns that had nothing to do with the adult drama that had separated us. Mom's been really sad, she said as we pulled into my driveway. She cries a lot. Dad says she's just stressed about money, but I think she misses you. I felt that familiar tug of guilt, but I pushed it away. Hazel's sadness was a consequence of her choices, not my responsibility to fix. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions. I said the same words I'd used months ago. It doesn't mean anyone is wrong or bad. It just means circumstances changed. Madison seemed to accept this with the resilience that teenagers possess. We spent the afternoon baking cookies and catching up. She told me about her boyfriend, her part-time job, her college plans. I told her about my watercolor classes, my volunteer work, my new friend Ruth. You seem different, she observed as we sat on the deck watching the sunset. Happier. Do I? Yeah. Like lighter somehow. Like you're not worried about everything all the time. Out of the mouths of babes again. That evening, as Madison helped me clean up the dinner dishes, she said quietly, I know Mom hurt your feelings somehow. She won't tell me exactly what happened, but I know it was bad. I just want you to know that I don't think you're a bad person for moving away. I stopped washing the dish in my hands and looked at my granddaughter. This wise young woman who'd managed to navigate family drama with more grace than the adults involved. Thank you for saying that, sweetheart. And thank you for coming to see me. It means more than you know. Can I come back? Maybe for Thanksgiving. I would love that. As I tucked Madison into the spare bed that night, she looked around the small room with its simple furniture and single window overlooking the lake. I like it here, she said. It feels peaceful. It is peaceful, I agreed. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs. After Madison fell asleep, I sat on my deck in the quiet darkness, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. Somewhere across town, Hazel was probably worrying about where her daughter was, probably calling friends and checking social media. Eventually she'd figure it out, and there would likely be angry phone calls and accusations. But for now, in this moment, I was exactly where I belonged. In a home that was truly mine, with a granddaughter who'd chosen to find her way to me. Living a life that finally fit. The cost of that peace had been higher than I'd ever imagined I'd be willing to pay. But as I sat there in the gentle darkness, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth every penny.